And our next presenter, I'm very pleased to say, is a colleague of mine at Cal State Fullerton, a rising star, actually has an award that says he's a rising star. It's Dr. John Gleaves. And John today is going to take a philosophical perspective for us. I think it's actually a very nice follow-up to Dan's final comments in his presentation. And he's going to be talking about kinesiology's Prometheus, medicine, philosophy, and enhancing human performance. Thanks, John.
Thank you. First, I just want to start publicly, and as I've prepared for this presentation, I've become acutely aware how much I really owe to this organization and people in the rooms as somebody coming into kinesiology. It's really clear to me a large reason why I have a job is because of work that people here have done. And I'd like to specifically thank two people, my doctoral advisor, Scott Kretschmar, and my faculty mentor, Debbie Rose, who've been very influential in helping me develop some of the ideas in here in this talk. You know, as philosophers, I've often heard how much maybe we see ourselves being under threat in the academy, in academia, in sciences. This has been an ongoing struggle that we've had. Where do we fit in a world where increasingly new knowledge is being produced through the natural sciences? And we've really tried to carve an argument out. And I look at kinesiology as a field, and I've found kinesiology to be actually incredibly receptive. I think it's telling that right now the editor for the Journal for Quest is a philosopher, and how many philosophers are members of the academy, how many philosophers are in the editorial board for major journals in kinesiology. So I'm very comfortable with this group and this group's willingness for philosophy, but I do think philosophy has a problem. And I'm going to try to get into this problem today using human enhancement as a way for us to maybe think about where philosophy should be, can be going in the future with kinesiology. I want to take you back to a young John Gleaves when I was a first semester graduate student at Penn State. And I was presenting a poster that I was very proud of. It outlined what were incredibly robust arguments about the ethics of performance enhancement in sport. I had John Stuart Mill's paternalism and Lowland's fair opportunity principle, and the faculty were coming through as part of the colloquium and grilling us graduate students. And one of our faculty, a former astronaut, listened politely and let me finish and say, okay, but that's all great. And what drugs are you talking about? Well, like steroids, those kind of drugs, right? Okay, but I mean, what's their mechanism of action? How do they work? How does that relate to the work you're doing? And it was a really big aha moment for me because I realized how incredibly ignorant I was to the substances that I was talking about, to how they existed in the world. And that really changed my course. I had to get a Powers and Howley textbook and learn exercise physiology. I enrolled in courses where I learned about the substances, and I really have tried to continue making sure that the natural sciences inform the work I've done as a philosopher. Now, when we think about the issue of human enhancement, in philosophy, we're a rather old discipline. We can look at some of the issues in human enhancement, and we find even with Plato and ideas of justice, or Aristotle and virtue ethics, we can already begin to see questions about human enhancement being developed. However, the ethics of human enhancement as a specific area in philosophical research is a really latecomer. In fact, we sort of trace it to the early works by Julian Huxley in the 1950s and 60s, which in our field is really modern, cutting edge. Huxley put forward an idea for us to think about. What can happen when humans can make themselves biologically better than well? I mean, in part, it was one of the first times that we could realistically ask ourselves that question, because advances in medicine, advances in technology were actually allowing us to consider these kinds of claims. And the very claims that Dr. Ferris was just mentioning, this idea about, if not 10, 20 years, we might have prosthetic limbs better than a normal human limb. Well, we're finally there as a human species that we can begin to ask ourselves these questions. And it develops what was one of the foundational questions that I want to present to you today: the treatment versus enhancement distinction. Philosophers have focused on this as one of the pivotal questions that we must ask in the ethics of human enhancement and human performance, is treatment versus enhancement. And to put this in perspective, I grabbed this quote because it so neatly captures how important this question is. The distinction between treatment and enhancement is enshrined in both our professional and governmental levels, and it continues to inform so many of our discussions about new biomedical advances. In fact, Dr. Ferris's talk perfectly sets up this idea, this question about, are we enhancing ourselves, or can we, or should we, or ought we? Now, if we think about it, just to sketch really quick, when we talk about treatments, I want us to think as a quintessential example, antibiotics. Antibiotics are either there to prevent or to remove a biological infection. They don't have any performance-enhancing characteristics. We don't start taking a daily dose of antibiotics as a sort of a prophylactic. We really use them in specific circumstances to just simply treat an acute issue. On the other hand, probably one of the things that we're most familiar with when we think of biomedical enhancements, we can think of an elite sport tied to performance-enhancing drug use. Erythropoietin would be one of those often used substances. Anabolic steroids or synthetic testosterone would be another. These are substances that we typically think about people using to make themselves better than they would normally be. Quite easily, it can just simply be boosting hematocrit from above a 46, 47, 48% to a 50, 51, 52. So at this point, we see now a use of an erythropoietin as a way of having a higher than normal hematocrit. And this has a performance-enhancing effect. Now, typically, we see enhancements as being morally problematic. Treatments, not so much. I wear contact lenses. Many of us have normal medications or see a doctor. If we have a deficiency that we need to somehow treat, we have no problem with the idea of returning ourselves to sort of our normal states. And I respect that's a fraught term, but we really do have no problem with this as a society and as ethicists. It gets to be more difficult when we think of enhancement. We typically think of enhancements as something we need to be concerned about, unintended risks. However, with enhancements, we don't need to be as worried as we often are. I'm going to use Alan Buchanan's argument about a vaccine. If we really stop for a moment, many of us, I imagine in this room, have been vaccinated. Vaccines are widely regarded as one of the best advances in public health that the humans have ever seen. Vaccines are not a treatment. They're an enhancement. They're designed to help the body's immune system prepare to recognize a foreign agent, see it as something that needs to be attacked, thus helping keep people healthy. So if we accept the idea that Buchanan puts out that a vaccine's an enhancement, moreover, a vaccinated society is a very important aspect of that enhancement. So while one person has a modest amount of benefit against a disease, if we vaccinate an entire city or entire population, it becomes much more resistant to a disease. And we add into the fact that there's some people who cannot receive vaccinations for various other health reasons. So I'm not talking about religious choice or personal values. I'm talking about medically that are not good recipients for a vaccine. We realize that they also receive a benefit living in a society with widespread vaccinations because they're inoculated by the people around them being inoculated. And now we begin to see a moral argument in favor of enhancements. In fact, as humans, we might begin to say we have a moral reason to make sure these enhancements are widespread. If you go back in time, very locally in my area, Anaheim, Disneyland, we have an outbreak of measles because of people not vaccinating their children anymore. Leads to passing of a law that now you are required to have vaccinations unless medically deemed otherwise to go to elementary school in California, regardless of personal choice. Now, it was a decision made about the moral importance of having those enhancements. On this front, this treatment enhancement distinction, I think it's really important to note that a lot of the work that has been done, in fact, if you look at the literature and mainstream philosophy on the treatment enhancement distinction, you'll actually find a lot of people from kinesiology cited who have done early works in this, in part because they were looking at issues of doping and performance enhancement. So this is one example where, rather than saying kinesiology needs to be at the table, kinesiology was at the table early on, and for that reason, it's been well respected in the philosophical literature. The second ethical issue that philosophers have tended to focus on with the enhancement issue is unequal distribution, or inequalities that emerge through the dissemination of enhancements. So when we're looking at, with amputees returning normal limb function through prostheses, this is easy, this is seen as a treatment. Now what happens when we start having enhancements that can make people better than well? Who accesses them? Who wins and who loses? Who gets the first wave and who gets the second wave? It becomes more problematic. We start thinking of cognitive enhancements. We think of ways in which income can be tied to enhancements. So you might make more money if you're one of the first people to get certain enhancements. When we start thinking about this issue, we really see a need to be slow, deliberate, and intentional as we begin to think about, well, now that we have it, how do we employ it? Again, this is another one in which kinesiology has been at the forefront. And I hold up this page. In the philosophy world, Stanford has this encyclopedia of philosophy. It's incredibly well done. They take leading experts from around the world to write very specific Wikipedia-type pages, heavily sourced and cited. So it's one of the few internet sources I let my students use. I counted 3 NAK members, and I stopped counting after 20 of philosophers that work in kinesiology fields that were cited in Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy because of these issues of treatment enhancement and the inequalities in playing fields, which is, I think, a way, again, kinesiology can pat itself on the back for nurturing good philosophy, that it's one of the areas where kinesiologists are shaping research at the highest levels outside of kinesiology. A third issue that we see with the human enhancement debate, and one that I find incredibly fascinating, is the larger question, what does it mean to be human? So we can think about the applied ethics of what counts as a treatment enhancement, what counts as unequal playing fields, but really when we start asking questions about enhancement, we very quickly run into these philosophical questions about what does it mean to be human. And I was preparing for this talk, I wanted to make sure I brought in good, relevant, hot topic kinesiology questions, and I wanted to look at aging, successful aging, in part because of my mentor, Debbie Rose, keeps bringing it up, and I thought this is a really good one for us to look at. I was going in, I thought, okay, this is perfect. Aging, human enhancements, delaying aging. And I began to look through the literature, seeing what's been done. Very little. And it was kind of exciting because it let me really try to sketch out a little bit of a new framework here. And I have to say there was an IPA involved as we finished up this typology, Debbie and I. But there's sort of three ways to think about enhancements in aging. One way is a passive attitude. It looks at aging as natural, and it sees the idea of treatment only being tied to age-appropriate function. Now, this is a logical implication of the view that we accept that enhancements are unethical. If we see the idea of enhancing ourselves better than well as being morally problematic, we oftentimes will lend to this view. On the far extreme, the other way, a view that sees age-related decline as undesirable and something that should be cured. But I think this also flies in the face of our question, what does it mean to be human? In a sense, the second view really denies an important part of the human experience. And a third way, an assumption that age-associated decline can be seen as normal, though we want to pursue enhancements that let us mitigate or restore capacities that get lost through aging. Again, this puts us back in a problematic position if we assume enhancements are morally problematic. But if we go back to the idea of the vaccine, where we can begin to be a little more comfortable with the idea of enhancements, we can be a little more comfortable with the idea of saying, let's prevent age-associated strength declines by 1 or 2 standard deviations in healthy populations. If we have an intervention, a treatment like that, or an enhancement like this, we can begin to see ways in which we have an aging population whose strength decline is now considered enhanced based on normal populations. And again, I'm not sure which of those views is the best because I'm relying on this one peer-reviewed article in all of the philosophical work I could find that looked at this idea of gerontology, anti-aging medicine, and human enhancement. That's surprising. It was shocking to me. As somebody who works in performance enhancement and doping quite a bit, it's incredibly difficult to find something on steroids that hasn't already been said 3 times over. To see something this wide open, I was shocked. I couldn't find anything in kinesiology journals with ethicists looking at this topic. And I think this is a problem. And it's a problem that I think really gets at the heart of where philosophy as a subdiscipline in kinesiology needs to look itself in the mirror and maybe begin to sketch out ways that it can help itself to make sure it has a continued seat at the kinesiology table and also a more involved seat in public policy and addressing social needs. The problem that I see was really I shouldn't say well captured. I don't want to praise him for this, but it was so perfect I could have kissed him. Steven Pinker, 2015, puts out a scathing editorial really condemning bioethicists. And Pinker should have known better because he's married to a great philosopher and a MacArthur Genius winner, Natalie Goldstein. She should have put him straight. So his answer to this is that bioethicists are bogging down research in red tape moratoria, threats of prosecution based on nebulous but sweeping principles such as dignity, sacredness, or social justice. And his conclusion here is that bioethicists need to get out of the way. Now, I disagree with Pinker, obviously, but I actually really understand where he's coming from. Michael Sandel, a Harvard philosopher, in his book about enhancement, he argues against enhancements, and this is his claim. They represent a kind of hyper-agency, a Promethean aspiration to remake our nature, including human nature, to serve our purposes and satisfy our desires. This is Sandel's argument against enhancement. Essentially, Sandel has just, in so many words, given the exact same argument why we shouldn't pursue enhancements that Pinker says these don't work. These are bogging down research. And so as much as I disagree with the solution being get out of the way, if I look really critically at the scholars in my field, I see what he's reacting against. In part, he's reacting against a very conservative attitude that not only philosophers have, but philosophers certainly perpetuate, that Sandel so kindly uses, the idea of Prometheus. And for those of you that don't recall your Greek mythology, I'll give you a quick primer. Prometheus was a Greek god known for stealing fire from Mount Olympus. Zeus wanted to keep it from people. Prometheus stole it and gave it to the human person. In the ancient Greek world, this had two important levels. In one sense, think about what fire means to the ancients. Fire was not only a way of warming themselves, it was a way of forging metal, it was a way of cooking food. But fire was also incredibly devastating. It can burn you. If fires go out of control, it can destroy an entire village. So in ancient Greek world, fire was definitely seen as a double-edged sword. And for that reason, there was an attitude, maybe humans shouldn't have fire. Maybe Zeus was right to keep us from having that technology. And this has become now known as this Promethean idea that humans should not play God. That humans should acknowledge their own limits, their own ignorance, and we do not trust ourselves with enhancement. In philosophical literature, you often see unsighted, unsubstantiated, but claims about unintended risks. We don't even know the harms that will come from pursuing this, and for that reason, we object to any forms of these kinds of research into human biomedical technologies. We see this reflected in the field. This is great. This summer, Pew did a big study of American attitudes about biomedical enhancements. And they gave them three. Gene editing with babies to reduce the risk of disease, brain chip implants for cognitive abilities, and synthetic blood for improving human physical performance. On all three of these, the American population was more worried than they were optimistic. So the default view was fear. And when you got down deep into the numbers, one of the strong indicators was that either these are technologies we shouldn't have, or that these are crossing certain religious views, that these are better left to the divine, to what is natural, not to humans. It's interesting how we have a public view, but in many ways, this view reflects a common public morality. And this is where my research into the sporting Prometheus is why have we adopted these attitudes as a society? There are some good reasons to be concerned, to be intentional, deliberate. But oftentimes, when we look at the technology that comes out, we find them reasonably to our liking. And we oftentimes don't see the unintended consequences that we initially feared. So I think philosophers have perhaps adopted a cautious view, and that might be in part what Pinker is frustrated with. But I think Pinker was also frustrated with a second issue that is very relevant to people in kinesiology. And I'm going to go here to C.P. Snow and his famous essay, Battle of Two Cultures. Snow published this in the 1960s. Snow recounts a conversation. He was an Oxbridge professor, chemist, between two dons at a Cambridge dinner party in the humanities fields. He doesn't say which ones. We can assume they were philosophers. They sounded pretty arrogant. So, we'll assume they were philosophers. And Snow says how these two were scoffing at their scientific colleagues because one of them had admitted he'd never even read any of the works of Shakespeare. And Snow piped up and said, "But can you tell me the second law of thermodynamics?" None of these Cambridge professors could. And his point that he stressed was, in my world, the second law of thermodynamics is the equivalent of saying, "Have you read Shakespeare?" And even more pressing was his concern that we have colleagues in the humanities, and it's his words, not mine, who have as much insight into modern physics as their Neolithic ancestors. In many ways, there's an incredible gap between what these philosophers know of their natural world and what their natural sciences colleagues know. Back to me as a graduate student, an incredible gap between what I knew as a philosophy student about the ethics of performance enhancement and the substances I was trying to philosophize about. That gap is a problem. I see it in the literature. I think this is great. If we go back historically, I've been able to go as far back as 1992. I haven't found an example from 1988. Every 4 years on the eve of the Olympic Games, there will be a news story that will rumor whether this will be the first Olympics we've ever seen genetically modified athletes, gene doping. Every 4 years we see one that says, well, maybe, but definitely in the next 10. And I found that article again for 2016. I was really proud that another journalist bit on this sort of narrative that we keep saying, well, maybe this year, but definitely by the next Olympics, we're going to see gene doping. And you look at people who actually do work in genetics, and if you ask them, how close are we to being able to do anything like what philosophers are talking about, genetically modifying an athlete to improve their strength or their endurance, if even such performances were that reductivistic to get from genetics to performance, and we're nowhere near that with the sciences. And so Steve Jones, this is about the babbling nonsense of a baldness cure. On the flip side, what I do see often with the philosophers are willingness to take a little bit to the extreme. So back to the Oscar Pistorius case. As we were trying to figure out whether or not Oscar Pistorius should be allowed to compete, and again, I point my own students right back to the work being done in the natural sciences to evaluate whether there's an enhancement advantage or whether it's a level playing field. But we have philosophers on the other hand worrying, well, what if we let him compete? What's going to be? Are we going to go and start removing our healthy natural limbs as soon as we have a better prosthetic? I just don't know anyone out there working in prosthetics or in medicine who's really worried about that problem. I mean, it's nice, I always assume it's nice to, when you're having a beer with your friends, you can think about it. But I think when you actually look at the research that's being done and the pressing problems, it's not about cyborgs and athletes amputating their limbs, but it is much more in this applied sense, enhancements for prosthetics, for disabled individuals. And we should begin to ask questions about when these technologies begin to offer advantages beyond well. What do we mean? What do we do? Why not use them? These are fair questions. But there's a long way from worrying about people cutting their legs off to win a gold medal. They're ages away from worrying about people selling organs on eBay. Another thing philosophers have debated. I think it's time that as a philosophical community, especially in kinesiology, we think of these rich, ripe questions in front of us, aging or enhancements, robotics. So, and again, to Dr. Ferris, when you talk about who should be at the table, and I wonder in all those groups, if there is a bioethicist at the table, I wonder what they can bring, and I guess if there's not one, and part of it is because I find so many of my colleagues incapable of engaging in the natural sciences at the level they need to be at the table. And that's an issue that we have to address in kinesiology as we train our sociocultural students. Can they be scientifically literate enough to be worth saying something to a room of people looking at enhancements in robotics? However, if we begin to think about this model of philosophers with scientific literacy, I think we really quickly begin to see the ways in which philosophy does, can, and will continue to contribute to kinesiology. I have a handful of examples. I'll use sort of one more formal and one more informal of these kinds of cross-disciplinary collaboration. And these aren't theoretical hypotheses how we should be doing. This is actually how I'm doing it right now. So one research project I'm involved in is a colleague, actually from University of Washington's Substance and Alcohol Abuse Prevention, who was part of that King County Task Force on Heroin and Opioids mentioned last night. He's also working with me and another colleague in counseling to look at mental health issues, performance-enhancing substance use in athletes during their suspension. Now, this project could have easily been one of just simply clinicians looking at mental health. But by bringing philosopher involved, it has a whole other area of moral component to it. What ethical obligation do we have to an athlete after they've violated a doping ban? I was having a conversation this morning with John Chalice and mentioning just how people have piled on to Lance Armstrong, and exactly there's a question: is this right? If we go back to the Olympic Games when Becky King was commenting about Yuliana Efimova from Russia, who had served a doping ban for an inadvertent use, and the sort of public shaming of an athlete who, through no fault of her own, had served her doping ban and come back to the sport. There is a reason to have a moral conversation there, as well as a mental health conversation. And so this formal collaborations resulting in grants right now, they're at the World Anti-Doping Agency and the International Olympic Committee. Informally, I had a really cool experience with a colleague at Cal State Fullerton. We always thought, so it's needed for kinesiology to organize ourselves cross-disciplinarily. So I just happened to have my next door colleague be a fantastic exercise physiologist. And I was asked to be expert witness on the Lance Armstrong case, this sort of $100 million case about defrauding the U.S. Postal Service. And an issue I needed to be able to address in my testimony was about enhancements and using these performance-enhancing drugs that he's admitted to using. I don't want to just ballpark it. I wanted to know how much of a benefit was this? What did it look like? Could a clean person have been competitive with Armstrong? Well, fortunately, Danny Rubin next door, I could just knock on her door and say, will you help me out? I want to answer this question. So we used a 40-kilometer time trial. She pulled the literature on how much changes in hematocrit affect VO2, VO2 changes in performance. And we were able to get quantifiably, not just the usual philosopher's rule of thumb estimate, but quantifiably a very good indication of what kind of enhancements we were talking about. I mean, again, not entirely precise, but way closer than I would have just on my own. It's that both informal collaboration and the formal collaboration through grants and research projects that I think this is how philosophy really thrives in kinesiology and how it really contributes to kinesiology. I also see how much of an impact we can have on the general public. So I know this has been a theme throughout the conference, but kinesiologists getting out of just our silos. When I saw the Pew study, one of the things that really blew me away was how little people knew about these human enhancements. So synthetic blood, only 3% said they knew a lot. 9% on gene editing was the largest. It tells me that there's a public that is interested in the topic but largely uninformed, and a chance for us to step in and share with them not just the groundbreaking research we're doing on enhancing performance, but also help with some of these ethical questions that as a society we have to wrestle through. So I just want to conclude, so sort of three takeaway points that I see. I think for philosophers, future frontiers require, I say, a fluency in the scientific language. They have to be bilingual. Philosophers don't have to be going out and doing the data collection, but they need to be able to, when they're at the table, understand the language and speak the language coherently. And that has to be coupled with subdisciplinary expertise. And I know this is something that Kathy Ennis, Scott Kretschmar, Patricia Vertinsky have all developed, this idea of how cross-disciplinary research should work. Strong disciplines and bilingual training. In human performance enhancement in particular, I really see us focusing on this work of today. It's not the science fiction, not the interesting what ifs in 20 years from now, but really trying to dive into this question. I was floored at how these ethical issues around aging and enhancement have just been left untouched. I was looking this summer, so the National Institutes of Health is considering removing the moratorium on the human-animal chimeras in gene therapy, gene research. No philosophers are at this table. There's so many areas in which philosophers can be looking at questions right now that are pressing social concerns, but they require a very good grasp of the sciences at work. Not what they imagine to be at work, but what actually scientists are doing. And I think that as philosophers in kinesiology, we have to really push ourselves to go beyond the world of just looking at elite sport. The vast majority of our literature in journals like Sports Ethics and Philosophy or the Journal of Philosophy of Sport, our really flagship journal, tend to focus on elite sport, questions of elite competition. However, if we look beyond elite sport, we see incredibly rich questions, areas for us to collaborate with colleagues in the discipline, and that have pressing social needs. I always really try to balance, as much as I want these big grants for my doping research, I have to keep in perspective that at the end of the day, whether Barry Bonds takes steroids or not is not nearly the pressing social concern as many other colleagues are looking at, obesity or health, physical activity across the lifespan. I mean, I always have to keep myself in check, but there are these really important social questions that philosophy has things to say about. And I think if they were at the table, they can shape the kinds of research that is being done. I can't speculate, but I do think that if we have a philosopher who's able to help these research teams ask questions differently, I think it's going to end in better answers. Thank you very much for your time.